Last week we finished chapter 5, so we can start on chapter 6. And there's Martin Thinga from Africa.
Yeah.
Welcome. All right, let's share a screen. There we go. All right, this story, Jesus feeds the 5,000. This is one of the few miracle stories that is found in all 4 of the Gospels. And even though it's apparently the same story, John tells it in a very different way. He'll even use different Greek words for the same thing. It's like there's, even though they're telling the same story, there's very little formal verbal overlap because he's stressing something else. So let's see what it is. This is verse 1, chapter 6, verse 1. This is kind of a transition verse, like John is just changing the scene for us. All right, the curtain goes down, the curtain goes up. Here we are. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That would mean the eastern side, which was where, it was more Gentiles lived on the east side. That was part of the Decapolis. There were some Jewish cities kind of on the east side. Bethsaida was just on the northeast end of the lake. But most of the eastern side was Gentile. But it's interesting that Jesus worked there, did miracles there too, and apparently with Jewish people. So he crossed to the far shore. The Sea of Tiberias is another name for it. It got that name after Herod Antipas built a new capital city and named it Tiberias after the emperor. And so that was kind of like, this is the Roman name for the lake. But that may have been at the time John wrote, that may have been the most commonly known name for it. I mean, we can look back on our old maps and see old names for territories that, we have to look up to see where Dalmatia is. Where was that? That region that named isn't in use anymore. That's because place names change, customs of naming change. Anyway, so that's at the time John was writing, Sea of Tiberias was a known name for the lake. And John tells us that a great crowd of people followed Jesus because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. So they could see him travel by boat across the lake, and then they could walk around. They didn't all have to follow him on boat. It was a small enough lake that they could do that. Although it was, it would take quite a few hours to walk all the way around. It's 13 miles long, but parts of it, it's very steep, and it's not an easy path to walk. But if Jesus is only crossing at the northern tip of it, that's only a few miles, say 4 miles, and people could walk that in an hour and a half, easily enough. So they were following him. That's what John wants us to know, because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. So they were hoping, were they hoping to see more, or was it because they themselves were sick and needed that healing? It sounds like that Jesus healed those who were sick, but people who were able to follow him were probably not sick, but they were interested in watching the spectacle. John's not too fond of people seeking after signs, and that happens today too. People sometimes prefer to see a spectacle than to understand and submit to the significance behind it. Well, Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. Sounds like he's ready to teach. He sat down. They're out there on the mountainside for a picnic. John tells us the Jewish Passover festival was near. So John is giving us, setting the scene in terms of the significance of Jewish festivals. He's going to make some kind of contrast there, and we'll see at a couple points in the story where he more intentionally contrasts what Jesus is doing with what Moses had done. He's setting up Jesus as better. Verse 5, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Well, Philip, we're not exactly what part of the shore Jesus was on, but it's possible that he was near the town of Bethsaida, which is where Philip was from. So Philip would be a natural person to ask, well, where can we get enough bread for these people to eat? They haven't even been there they haven't even arrived yet, but he's thinking already of feeding them. Now, then John tells us in verse 6, he asked this only to test Philip, because Jesus already had in mind what he was going to do. He knew, this is another example of where Jesus knew the situation ahead of time. He knew this probably even before he went over to that side of the lake, what was going to happen there. He had this planned out. Philip answered him, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. And there are all sorts of logistical problems there. And they were out on a mountainside. Who is selling bread? The 7-Eleven hasn't been built there yet. He can't go. It would not only take a lot of money to do it, it would also take a lot of time for them to go to a nearby village and find enough bread for 5,000 people. It's just not going to work. Philip was kind of like he doesn't know how to answer the question because it's not possible. All right, throws up one objection, but Jesus already knows how to take care of it. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? It's kind of it's like a minuscule amount compared to 5,000 people. Like, why even mention it? Does think perhaps that Jesus might be able to do something with 5 small barley loaves? Now, these loaves of bread are made of barley. Barley doesn't have much gluten in it, so that doesn't stick together very well. So the loaves are usually small, more like a small roll, what we would call a roll. And the boy carried 5 with him. That's his lunch, five small pieces of bread, 2 small fish, maybe sardine size. So he doesn't have much, but Andrew says, well, this is what we have. How far will it go? It could have been said with optimism, or it could have been said with pessimism. Well, Jesus was optimistic. He said, have the people sit down. And there was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. And that's there. It uses the Greek word specifically to males. There were additional, would have been women and children in addition to them. So it's a pretty big crowd. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. There was an abundance. He did the same. Well, and other gospels tell us that the disciples were used to help distribute this food. It wasn't Jesus interacting directly with all 5,000 of them. But somehow the food got distributed around. They did the same with the fish. Everybody had enough fish to eat. And verse 12, when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. So this is a kind of a interesting principle there. They didn't just leave the leftovers on the ground. I'm not sure what they actually did with them. They gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. So people didn't, take a little extra and stuff it in their pockets for their way home. There was just extra waiting to be gathered by the disciples. There was an abundance of food out of these 5 loaves and 2 fish. Any comments from you so far?
Yes, Pastor Mike.
Yes,
I
very
may
much.
ask. You mentioned a while ago that the account of John was a little different from the account of the other Gospels. Can you tell us more about what you meant?
Like one example, I did mention that the other Gospels tell us that the disciples were intermediaries, that they were helping to distribute the food. One of the other Gospels said that they sat down in groups of 50 or something like that, reminiscent of the groups of people when the Israelites were in the wilderness of Sinai. John doesn't include those particular details, but for example, he says there's plenty of grass in that place. I think as the Gospel of Mark says, the grass was green, which is what we expect in at the time of Passover, springtime. But it's just small details like that. It does not seem as though that John is directly borrowing the story from those written sources. He is telling it afresh from his own memory. I once made a document in which I highlighted all the different words. I should have brought that to the screen today, but I'm not sure where in my computer it is right now.
But, another one in verse 11. I can be wrong, but sometimes the way it is written kind of makes you picture communion. When it says Jesus took the loaves, thanks, and distributed. Sometimes I wonder, is John kind of linking that with a similarity to, because his focus is very theological, but then that's just my guess. What do you think?
Right. Yeah. He seems. It does seem to be an allusion. It's not that he's not saying that Jesus was doing the communion in here in the mountains before his crucifixion, but the way even this word for Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks. The word gave thanks is Eucharisto, which is like our English word Eucharist, referring to communion. And the early church did use this passage as one of their texts for communion or the Eucharist or whatever they wish to call it, Mass or Lord's Supper. Goes by different names. But they would use this John 6 as part of their teaching passage for describing what the bread and wine were for. But of course, there's no wine involved here. But it's still the way that John tells the story evokes, would remind people of some similarities with what Jesus did at the Last Supper. So yeah, your observation there is right. Thanks for reminding me of it.
Mike,
Yes,
this is
yes,
Janet.
Janet.
I have a couple of comments on it. The things that I've thought about with this and it was always in terms of our offertories that Jesus was the one that was doing the work, no doubt about it. He was the one that made the meal possible. But here was a boy. Now, probably other people had a little food with them, but here was somebody that had very little to offer, and yet he offered it. And as far as we know, he was the only one who did. And Jesus took that and just did something astonishing with it. And in terms of our response to what we can do, we often don't have very much, but perhaps it can do more than we thought. And another thing is about, I think about, again, Jesus was one that was doing the work, but that didn't mean there wasn't anything for the disciples to do. They had work to do too, to distribute that much food and to do the cleanup afterwards. No small thing. And so that's kind of our response, perhaps, is that Jesus is the one that accomplishes what is accomplished, but we have a part to play in it too.
Right. Yeah, that's good lessons to draw from that. Yes. I suspect that Andrew knew the boy. And that's why he knew that the boy had 5 small barley loaves. And I don't know. Yeah. Did none of the disciples have any food to offer? I don't know. I hadn't thought about that before. But the boy, at least, he had something to work with. And so, Jesus can take a small amount and make much of it, as only Jesus can do. One other thought I had is when they gathered them up, verse 13, they filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves. And I had wondered for a while why they carried baskets with them. Apparently, a basket can also be used as a measurement. So this could just be as we will sometimes use bushel as a measurement, not just as it can also refer to a basket. A peck can refer to a basket, or it can refer to a measurement. So they picked up this much, this great a quantity of 5 barley loaves left over. So they weren't necessarily carrying baskets with them, but they did pick up a lot of leftover barley loaves.
Sometimes, Mike, it does make me curious about the fish. Is that dried fish, salted fish? Do they eat it fresh? I mean, didn't they cook it or what, I'm just curious, to us now, I wonder how that tasted if it is just sun-dried,
Yeah, Galilee did export dried salted fish. So that's probably a good guess for what it would have been. A bit crunchy. If it's the size of a sardine, then they would be eating it, bones and all. But it's something that they could pack for a lunch.
Any significance as far as why 5 and why 2?
No, I have. Sometimes the medieval church waxed eloquent on all sorts of numbers, but I don't recall anybody ever making anything out of those numbers. They are theologically non-significant, I guess. Or I suppose you can do something with 2, 5 barley loaves. Let's see, that's 5 books of Moses. How about that? Any other comments? Then we go down to verse 14, and here is how people responded to this sign. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." This refers to Deuteronomy 18, where Moses predicted that a prophet would eventually arise whom they should listen to. So that was part of their expectations for a Messiah, that the Messiah would be a prophet like Moses. And here, this Jesus is like Moses in that he's giving food. So they're thinking, well, yeah, this is it. But they had other ideas of what that prophet should be. And verse 15 refers to that. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. They saw Jesus as the prophet in the line of Moses, and they wanted to make him king. They wanted him to be a military leader like Moses was. Now, Jesus was not ready for that. He was king, but he wasn't that kind of king. So he withdrew. Doesn't say exactly how he escaped the desires of the crowd, but somehow he did not allow them to do that. But it shows that he had a popularity and that people were willing to follow him. They were looking for a leader. And Jesus seemed to fit the bill of what they were looking for. They could do some great signs, heal people, produce food. Yeah, that's surely God is with him. And therefore, they wanted the rest of the agenda to go with it. They wanted God's agent to do what they wanted and not follow the agenda that God had. They didn't realize that there was a difference there. So that verse kind of suggests some social dynamics going on in the crowd. Any comments?
Yes, Pastor Mike. So it seems that Christ was pretty much aware of the script, where this thing that may happen, where they will force him to be a king by force, is not according to what he understood to be. So he kind of makes a decision. This is not the way I want it to be. So he seems to be in control as to where he is going. He was aware. Yes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's like earlier in John told his mother, "My time is not yet." Jesus had this understanding of, sketched out in his mind how his ministry would go. And he had a timeline. And wait, hey, this changing water to wine, that's not part of my timeline. Well, okay, I can do it anyway. But he still had ideas of how it was to go. And he would make, and this was definitely not part of it. It's kind of ironic that even a crowd would want to make a king by force, that they could force the king to do what they wanted. That's kind of like, that's not the definition of a king, is it? Doesn't the king have the authority? Well, the crowd was trying to have it upside down. Jesus didn't want that. So he withdrew again to a mountain. Plenty of mountains in the area. He got away from the crowds. Others? Then a couple of the other Gospels follow this story with Jesus walking on water, and John does as well. So this is another miracle, one miracle followed by another. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. Now, apparently, it was common enough for the disciples to go places without Jesus. They weren't with him 24 hours a day, all the time. There were times when they separated, and this was apparently one of them. Jesus went to the mountain, his disciples were going to go back home. They got into a boat, set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now, it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. Well, he missed the boat. That it didn't bother him. He had plans for that too. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. And the people who live there say, yes, sometimes the winds can come across those mountains quite strong. It doesn't have to be a storm. If there were clouds blowing in, it would be very evident to people that a strong wind was going to come. But sometimes the wind can come without any clouds at all. If it's coming from the desert, there's no moisture out there to create clouds to blow it in. Anyway, it can stir up the waters pretty quickly. Verse 19, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, come to think of it, that means that they were trying to row. If they were going with the wind, they would have had a sail up, but they were rowing. So were they rowing into the wind? That's what it sounds like to me, but that's, yeah. They saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on water, and they were frightened. That's like they didn't know what to do. One of the other gospels says they thought it was a ghost. But Jesus says, no, it's not a ghost. And besides that, at least among the Greeks, they didn't think that ghosts could walk on water. Or when people died, they had to pay a boatman. They'd put a coin in the person's mouth to pay the boatman to get across the river Styx, because they can't walk across the river. They had to have a boat. Ghosts can't walk on water. So why did they think Jesus was a ghost? Well, that was impossible. What was possible? What's possible is that Jesus is God. And God is said in the Old Testament to be able to walk on water and to still the waves. But they didn't go for that impossibility. They were thinking, they were frightened because it was a ghost. I'm not sure what they thought the ghost would do to them. But verse 20, Jesus said to them, it is I, ego, eimi. Those two little words, it is I. And later in the book, where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, those two words, I am, are often taken to be a reference to the name of God that God gave to Moses, revealed to Moses at the burning bush. I am, as my name is I am. Here, it's less clear that Jesus is referring to the I am name of God, although in this context of walking on water, it is suggestive that he is. He says, but either way, it means, well, I am, I'm the one, you're seeing me. Don't be afraid. I'm not a ghost. I'm your friend. Yeah, don't be afraid. Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Some scholars think that this describes another miracle. Others say, well, it just means that Jesus was walking on the water most of the way across the lake, and they had already gotten near to where they were heading anyway. I think John points this out because he sees some miraculous significance in it. That, immediately they were right where they wanted to be. That was significant. Any comments from you? Don't try this at home. It in a way, it is kind of an odd miracle. This is not meeting human needs. There is no, no people aren't yearning to have water walkers come to their region. And this was not in the ballpark of what they were thinking a Messiah would do. It's just startlingly different. It has no purpose other than to show that Jesus is, I don't know, has remarkable, unprecedented powers, and as supports John's purpose in showing that Jesus is the Word who was God and with God.
I love that you just said that, because it is kind of an odd, episode where he all of a sudden he's walking on water, and it's like, okay, but how does that help others, or yeah. So I really like that has brought a new outlook on that, coming from John's perspective.
Yeah, there was a skeptical German scholar in the 1800s who suggested that all these miracle stories about Jesus were simply made up by the disciples because they were convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. So they went back to the Old Testament and saw all the miracles that a Messiah was supposed to do, and they created stories of how Jesus had done such and such a thing. Well, his whole theory falls pretty flat when we go back to the Old Testament and realize the Old Testament does not describe miracles that the Messiah does. This is one that's just way out of the ballpark. It's just quite unexpected. No, things like, oh yeah, feeding a crowd of 5,000 people. Yeah, that's like Moses. We can see, people might possibly, looking for a Messiah to do that sort of thing. But yeah, they were not looking for water walkers. It's just a kind of a subtle evidence of authenticity there. It's the unexpected.
Yes.
All right. Verse 22. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake, they stayed there overnight. No camping gear apparently with them. People just knew how to sleep outdoors. They had stayed there, that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that they had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. And, well, the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there. They don't know where Jesus went to, I guess. They got into the boats and went to Capernaum. Well, they think he's somehow in Capernaum. I don't know how they thought he might have gotten there. They wouldn't have imagined that he would have walked on the water, but they knew he didn't get into the boat. They knew he wasn't anywhere around them. But as John had told us earlier, that he did go up to another mountain. So it's quite possible he would have gone there. But for some reason, they wanted to look for him in Capernaum. They knew that's where he lived. Well, they were searching for him. And so that leads then into the next story. John just kind of changing scenes again, but setting the scene for this next part of the story, a spiritual lesson that develops from the feeding of the multitude. He doesn't really draw a lesson out of the walking on water. That's unusual, I guess. John seems to get spiritual lessons out of other details, but not that one. Here he's drawing out the lesson out of the feeding the multitudes. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Well, Jesus didn't really answer them, as is often the case. People ask questions and Jesus answers with something else. Perhaps he's addressing their real concern, their real question. Very truly, I tell you, you're looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Earlier, John said that they had followed him over there because of the signs, but verse 26 seems to imply that their interest in signs was primarily for their own self-benefit. It wasn't to authenticate Jesus as their Lord. They simply wanted the benefits that he could give them. You ate the loaves and had your fill. That's what you want. Just like those, and well, we'll see a little later that there are comparisons here between the food that the people were seeking here and the water of the woman at the well of Samaria. She was thinking about, well, give me that water so I don't have to come here anymore to drink. She was thinking in terms of her physical thirst. These people are thinking in terms of their physical hunger. Jesus is saying that, yes, I can take care of those physical needs, but I have something more important to give you. And that's the spiritual, filling your spiritual thirst and your spiritual hunger. I am the one who can fill that need for you. Verse 27, do not work for food that spoils, that physical stuff, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him, God the Father has placed his seal of approval. He's bringing this connection with God the Father again. Well, verse 28, they ask him, like they're changing the subject. They're asking him about a different word. What must we do to do the works God requires? Well, Jesus has talked about God the Father placing a seal of approval on somebody. That's all right. What do we do to get that? What? And more generally, we might say, what must we do to? What does God want us to do? Well, and so Jesus responds, verse 29. The work of God is this. This is what he wants you to do, to believe in the one he has sent. That's kind of like the starting point. If you do the other stuff, but don't get this one, it's not going to be good enough. You can, dot all the I's and cross all the T's, but if you don't believe Jesus, it's not going to be enough. You have to believe in the one he has sent. The agent he has sent. That is what they were looking for. They were looking for somebody that God would send. But they're looking for, they're looking for a figure, yes, but they have the wrong idea of who that person, that person would be doing. So Jesus has to kind of reorient their thinking. So they asked him, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? So they seem to understand that he is referring to himself and saying, believe in the one he has sent. Believe in me because God has sent me. That's what God wants you to do. So they are asking, so what will you do then? They've already seen signs. They saw signs of when he healed people. They saw the sign of multiplying loaves and fishes. and here they are asking for another sign. Let's give us some more evidence here. What will you do? And here they refer to a scene from the books of Moses. Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And Jesus said to them, very truly, I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but he is God. It is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Well, he's talking about himself there, but they have to go a little further in the discussion to learn that. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. That's like the Samaritan woman. Yeah, give me that kind of water. And Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes me will never be thirsty. So he's using both figures of speech there, that he supplies all of those needs. That he is what, that people need bread and water for physical life. He's saying for spiritual life, you need me. I am the equivalent of the bread and water that you're looking for. But you need to be thinking deeper than just bread and water. Well, any comments any thoughts from you? Just easy for me to just get into the story and keep going, but I want to stop sometimes to see, because some of you have good questions and thoughts.
Sorry, I have a question here.
Yes.
I can't find the verse, but somewhere you said that you read that God sent Jesus, but I just want to know, because in the triune God they are equal. How can the Father is sending the Son as if the Son is younger? He doesn't have power like the Father.
It's a good question in that it's if the persons in the Godhead are all equal, how can one send the other? Does send imply some kind of authority over the other? One response to that is to see the situation here that the Son is in an incarnate state, as he is a human. And God is sending the human to do this. Another thought is that one of the persons had to become human, and we don't understand all the inner dynamics of the triune God, but it could have been that any of them could have been the one who was sent. That like rolling a dice or something, just random, and that whoever was sent then had the name Son, and whoever was left was the Father and the Spirit. And the way that they have. I hate to use the word divided, but according to their respective roles, because they're not divided. They're all working in unity with all that is done. But Jesus, as a human being, has to be under the authority of the Father, of God in heaven. So he can use this language that he has been sent. He comes into the world. This is something new, and he always does the will of his Father, he says, because he's a human being, and this is what human beings should have always been doing. So that, all right, does that respond to your question? It's not, I
Yeah.
don't think it's a complete answer.
Thanks.
But yeah, that's something that theologians do struggle with, as to how to best describe the relationships between the different persons of the Trinity, particularly, and it's complicated when in that one of them has become flesh, and as flesh, as a human being, must clearly be subordinate. But yet Jesus has this double role of being completely divine and completely human. So at what point do properties apply to one, and what point do properties apply to the other? And sometimes, the early theologians, the early church leaders would sometimes try to separate things out. Jesus did this miracle in terms of his divinity, and he wept according to his humanity. And I don't think that those kind of partitioning efforts, I don't think they hold water. It's kind of like they're ad hoc explanations. So there's some mystery going on there that's, as some say, it's beyond my pay grade. I see the professional theologians disagreeing among themselves as to the best way to explain what's going on there. We see that, as John starts out, the Word was God, that he had all the rights, privileges, honors that God had. But he was voluntarily, as Paul says, he voluntarily humbled himself. He emptied himself to become a human, fully subservient to what God is doing.
Yeah, Pastor Mike, I think the struggle there too is, we all struggle with it, because there's the reality of the spiritual realm, the kingdom of God, and then we have our reality here as flesh and blood, bound by time and space. And so we have our own limitations as far as our experiences, as far as our vocabulary. And so it is really challenging when we try to understand the things of God, where it's so difficult to find the right vocabulary to understand. It's like me when I was younger as a father, trying to explain to my 3-year-old what, electricity is all about. Could not grasp. It's a reality. So just the fact that my child cannot understand it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just that he cannot understand. So there are many, I think that's what it is. There so much in the spiritual realms that are beyond our vocabulary. So we struggle, but it's there. It's so clear in the scripture. There's Father, Son, Spirit, but how all the details, how that works, I think we look forward to the time and we fully get to understand more.
Right. I think I talked about that last time, how some of the language of scripture is God is condescending to our level to put things at a level that we can understand. So Jesus, by saying, the Father sent me, he is using that as in terminology that people would understand. He recognizes the Father has greater authority now. Was sent the best word to use before he was sent? Well, maybe not. Maybe it was. Some theologians describe this as the covenant that the Father and the Son made. They agreed that he would do this. He volunteered for the job, and the Father accepted that volunteer role. Is that sent? Well, yeah, it's maybe the word is a simple word that conveys what Jesus wanted to say here, without being more precise as we might want it to be. But That's it tells us something about Jesus sees himself in a role of doing his Father's will. Anyone else? All right. Verse 35, I think I read verse 35. Jesus declared, I'm the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me, and still you do not believe. They'd not only seen him, they had seen some of the signs that he had done, and yet they still didn't believe. Verse 37, all those the Father gives me will come to me. Whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. So he's saying that, he's kind of offering an explanation for why people aren't believing in him. The Father has not yet given them eyes to see. But if the Father wants them to come, then they will come to Jesus. And whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. I'm not, he accepts all those who the Father sends. For I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. So this is more verses talking about what I was talking about earlier, that he's subservient to the Father. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all those he's given me, but raise them up at the last day. This verse is used by those who teach predestination, that God decides who will come to Jesus. Jesus keeps them all and raises them all up at the last day. There's no loss in between there. Other verses can cause us to question how strictly that operates. Is a strictly linear progression there? Well, it makes us wonder. And I was recently reading a book that had a short chapter on this, and he just says, well, yeah, some verses indicate predestination, other verses indicate that people make their choices, and God inspired scripture with both of these. We're not supposed to try to turn it into a formula, an exact linear progression, but we each, and this is a conclusion I came to quite a few years ago now. So it's like, well, if the Father has predestined my decisions, well, that's great, but I still have to make them. I still have to make those decisions. So, I'm still in the same place. I have to, in this case, I have to decide to follow Jesus. And I can do that only if the Father sent me, but if the Father does send me, I still have to decide that. So I'm left with both there, that God wants this, God has designed me for this, but yet I still need to do something to be in agreement with him, to follow through on what he has designed for me. Well, that's a digression. Jesus is describing it here as that, all right, not everybody's going to follow me. And he has other passages in the other Gospels that talk about that too. He doesn't expect everybody to follow him, but he knows that some will, and they do so only because the Father has enabled them to do so. Any comments from you on that highly controversial topic?
What stood out to me tonight as never before is, I lost the verse. Is it verse 36? Oh yeah. Verse 36, but as I told you, you have seen me, and yet you still do not believe. I think I used to think you have seen me, like you have seen what I've done, you've seen my miracles. But as I look at it now, I see that it says, but you have seen me. Maybe not so much my miracles, but you have seen me, the God incarnate, the Messiah, the the one, but you do not believe. Anyway, it just kind of stood out to me.
Yeah, and it's like they what they saw should have been enough for them to believe, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
Because of their deficiency, not because of the deficiency of the evidence.
Yes.
Like they saw who he was, but they wouldn't entrust themselves to him. We want a king who will do what we want. We don't want this. We don't want to have to take the risk of letting Jesus go at his own pace, because people who do that get killed by the Romans. We don't want that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not. Yeah, it's hard to know exactly what they were thinking. But yeah, we can imagine different kinds of, and different people may have been thinking different things too. So all of the above might be true. Any others? Thanks, Peggy.
Thank you.
Mike?
Yes, June.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question, but Jesus was talking to the people here, not the Pharisees or the priests, right?
Yes.
So he's arguing with the people here. And in other instances, he was arguing with the Pharisees.
Right. There's a later chapter. He has a very focused argument against the Jewish leaders. Here, it just seems to be, you talked earlier in the chapter about a crowd came there, apparently common people, lots of them. Yeah. Maybe the Pharisees weren't looking for a Messiah. The common people were.
Yeah.
And they were more desperate to be delivered from the Romans. Mm-hmm.
Pastor Mike.
Yes, Burmy. Pastor Burmy.
We had quite a few theological statements here. I mean, the triune God, the free will and predestination and so forth. I remember what my professor at the Azusa Pacific mentioned when she defined theology. I think I mentioned this before. She defined theology as man's attempt to understand what God has chosen to reveal about himself. So all of this is an attempt because we are limited, but then we are also limited to what God has chosen to reveal about himself. There is so much more beyond, what we can. And so I think that's when faith enters in, where we cannot fully understand, and yet we believe, so that's our Christian walk. It's a lot of it is faith. And we believe in Jesus, not just the historicity of Jesus, but the transformation that happens in our lives. That to us is a stronger proof. The miracles that Christ does in our own personal experiences.
Right. Yeah. We don't get all of our questions answered. People like to ask them, but yeah, we have to be willing to admit that maybe the question isn't answered, and we shouldn't be condemning people who come, have come out to different conclusions on the matter.
Yeah.
All right, well, it is past 8 o'clock, so I will turn off the recording and let's see, stop the share, and then I can turn off the recording. No.
Thank you. Thank you, Pastor Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you. What a blessing.
Good to see everybody.